Well, only occasionally in history does massive technological change combine with rapid demographic shifts and huge social trends, and at the same time, ongoing generational change. So much so that the confluence of those trends altogether alter society within the space of a decade. And today we are in the midst of one such transformation. So it's little surprise that there is more research than ever before and more data than ever before, helping us try to get a handle on this change and understand these shifts and respond to these trends. But unfortunately, so much of that data is as inaccessible as ever, still largely consisting of long reports and statistical tables and lengthy explanations. And yet research is at its best when it paints a picture, when it tells a story, when it's research you can see, when it's visual, when it's research that makes sense with the eyes and with the heart. A few moments ago, I was introduced as a social researcher, and that's what my job title says, that's what my business card says, and that's what I am. But, that's what we all are. We're all social researchers. We all observe our society. We look at the changes. We make interpretations. We gather insights, and we make decisions based on what is around us. But we're not only social researchers, we're visual researchers. Most of the information we gather is that of what we see. Most of the data we collect is gathered through the eyes, and it's that information that we see that informs us. We don't act upon something until we can see it, and so it's visual research in the main. And that makes sense because we're in a visual world. We are surrounded by images and systems and symbols, and it's those images that inform us. And that's how we gather our information as well. More than ever, we're moving from this era of information age to infographic age. We're moving from an era of big data to visual data because that's how we gather and process information. That's how the human brain works. And that's how research should look. I mean, it's called research for a reason. It's called insights on purpose because it's what you see that makes sense, and it is on that we can act. We've got to move, therefore, from tables to visuals. We've got to move from just the concepts of data to the visualization of that data if it's truly to make sense and to have impacts and to be acted upon. It's not words that lead to action, but visuals that do so. It's graphics that inspire a response. I mean, have a look at the signs and the symbols around us. No smoking, and no diving, and even no Gangnam Style. But we take action. I think that's fair enough anyway, but we take action based on what we see. And of course, these symbols cut across language barriers. They communicate across the generations, from the very youngest to the very oldest. That's why road signs, of course, are in symbol or visual forms. Words aren't required. Pedestrian crossing and kangaroos crossing. I love it how even the animals know where they're supposed to cross. And even sometimes Gandalf saying no crossing. But no words are required when we communicate through these road signs. Even the devices that we carry increasingly have no words written on them. We don't need the word play to be written on the device because the triangle tells the story. Stop, pause, record. It's all communicated to us visually. And increasingly in this digital era with more digital tools, it's the symbols that are universal. We don't need the words. Even when you're looking at real estate ads, you don't need a description in words of how many bedrooms and how many bathrooms. The icons tell the story. 2 bedrooms, 1.5 bathrooms. Not too sure about the 1.5 car spaces. What do you do with that half a car space? Not all that useful, perhaps. Nonetheless, it's the visuals that inform our decisions. And so if you're deciding which restaurant to go to or which cafe to visit, you'll look at the star ratings, you'll look at the responses, the votes, and so much of that is presented visually. If you're choosing which pathway to walk down, you will do a little traffic study by looking at the wear marks in the grass, and that will inform to you the road most travelled and influence your decisions. If you're at a cafe and there are magazines or books out there, you can work out the popularity of those magazines by looking at the use marks, the wear marks, the dog ears on those magazines. You know the most popular articles because of the crease marks, and so you gather evidence visually as social researchers. Even a few moments ago, we did a show of hands. That tells the story. The length of a queue, that tells the story. We gather information through these research methodologies every day in visual forms. You and 500 million other people saw Charlie get his finger bitten, and you've watched this video on YouTube, no doubt, and many others because of the likes and the views and the ranks and the hits and the referrals, which all come to you in visual form. And the visual forms are growing, of course, and the evidence available to us in that visual sense influences us more than ever before. And while we might think we're moving into this new era of the visual presentation of information and data, actually we're just returning to the old. From the most ancient African carvings to Egyptian hieroglyphics, information was shared in visual form. Data was shared through symbol form. And that's what we've moved back to today. Even Australia's first peoples communicated thousands of years before we had ever heard of the term infographic through infographic form. Here from some Indigenous rock art, we've got the symbol for male and female, differentiated based on the tools that they would use, and a little different from the symbols that we in the modern era use to communicate through icons information about gender. Ancient Indigenous rock art will separate an adult from a child by the scale and the symbols used, and again, tools that are used today in the communication of information visually. And so, from kangaroo tracks or goannas or the presence of birds presented through these visual forms, different animal categories presented in symbol forms differently. So today, we use the same methods, visual presentation of cats or dogs or fish. In fact, let's think about that metaphor of Australia as a street. You know, if Australia, our 23 million people, was shrunk down to be a street of 100 households, across those 100 homes, thinking about the pets and animals that we have today, there would be, on Australia Street, 27 cats and 45 dogs. So dogs are more popular than cats after all. And 252 fish, which are more popular than all other pets in Australia combined. But how did we get, with such a strong visual tradition, to information, to data being shared like that? What happened? Where did the train leave the tracks? Now, it's not just big data, this era that we're in, but we've got to move away from boring data and make sure it's communicated in a way that makes sense. This, though, is important data. This is all of the births and deaths and marriages that take place in Australia each year. It's essential stuff, but presented in that form, of course, it's going to have no impacts at all. I've taken the same data and then presented it in this Australia Street model. So that same data presented this way, if Australia was this street of 100 homes, then we know on average, across these 100 homes each year, there would be 1.4 marriages. There would be 1.7 deaths. There would be 3.5 babies born on that street each year. If you live on a street of the average length of 100 homes, then there is a lot of activity in your street. And on your street and every other street in Australia, this is what goes on per year. A marriage, therefore, every 9 months. A death every 7 months per street. A birth every 15 weeks. And so this isn't just big data or impersonal data. This is your story. This is our story. This is us. And so the need to move to the democratisation of information. So to take information out of the hands of the statistical experts alone and set it free so that it can be understood and accessed and gained and have influence over all of us who own the data. It's our story. If you look at the growth of data in the world, it paints an even more compelling picture for the need for information to be accessible and shared in easily understandable and consumed forms. There is so much data being created these days. In fact, there are 2.5 quintillion bytes of data created in our world every day. That is so much data that 90% of the information in the world today has been created in the last 2 years alone. That is phenomenal, and yet so much of it inaccessible and not having the impacts it should have because it's presented in forms like that rather than visual forms. Now, this is important data as well. This is the growth of Australia, the population growth of Australia. It's our story, and it tells an important story, but the insights are hard to gain when it looks like that. But I've taken it and put it in infographic form and compared our growth to some other nations. Let's take Germany's growth in the 100 years since 1913. They have increased their population by 25%. That's not too bad. The UK in 1913 was at 45 million people. Now they're at 63 million people, an increase of about a third. Sweden has increased their population in a century by 73%. Back in 1913, their population was larger than our population. They were at 5.5 million people. We were at 4.7 million people. But in the 100 years since, they've gone from 5.5 million people to 9.5 million people. And we've gone from 4.7 million people to 23 million people, showing our growth there at 490%. Gold medal performance right there. Go Australia. But it highlights, I think, clearly in visual form how information, when presented that way, makes a difference. World's best data can only go as far as the visual form of it will allow. World's best analysis will have no impact unless it can be accessed, and therefore needs to be designed in a world's best way. You know, there are 2 million academic papers published every year across thousands of different academic journals, and yet the majority of them are never cited. 1.6 million out of the 2 million are never cited by anyone else. What a tragedy. All of that great research going unread and unaccessed. There are more than 7,000 PhD theses published in our world every year. That's an incredible amount of research. In fact, based on average word length of a thesis, this means that there's about 500 million words of quality research being written by these PhD students per annum. And yet the average PhD thesis is read just 4 times, which is fairly scary considering that there are normally 3 examiners of a PhD thesis. There's at least 1 supervisor, and there's the candidate themselves, so someone's not doing their reading. But I think the bigger tragedy is that there is great research that isn't accessed by the mainstream people because of the form in which it's presented. In fact, even though research isn't read when it is read, it isn't retained when it's in that data-rich or written form. If you look at the latest neuroscience studies, it shows that information, when it's in written or verbal form, cannot be retained in the brain for very long, and not much of it can be retained in terms of capacity either. So we've got some time limitations and some size limitations on what our brains can remember when it's in written form. But if you look at the visual presentation of information, there are no known limits to the power of the brain to recall visual images and symbols, both in terms of the length of time we can store them and the amount that can be stored. That is why all of the mnemonic tools and all of the brain memory tools involve visuals rather than words, because that's the power of the brain. Here is a page from a report that we have written into happiness and money. Now, there are some great insights in it, but you can't gather it very easily when it's in a form like this. But here I've put up just a part of an infographic which explains it. And it tells a very interesting story. We might think that those who have above average incomes also would be above average in happiness, and certainly there's a lot in that category that are. But the group that have the highest proportion of people above average in happiness, as far as well-being and life satisfaction, are the people who have below average income. And so it probably just tells us visually what we've all known, that money can't buy happiness. You know, until that last Excel table has been transformed, we've all got work to do. Until the last statistical or long-winded report has been presented in accessible forms, I think that we have to keep working at presenting information in fun ways. Data should be fun. You should be able to play with it. It should be interacted with. It should look like animations. It should be enjoyable. Reports shouldn't just sit on shelves and languish there, but they should be shared on social media. They should be interacted with. They should be beamed onto buildings, because that's the sort of research that has an impact and makes a difference. Now, just because something is visual doesn't mean it's impactful. These are the equivalent of cliches in the visualization world. Bar charts and pie charts and line graphs. We can do better than that, because these won't engage people because they're a little tired in their form. We did some research into cliches recently, and we found that Australians really do get irritated by cliches. You know, the phrases you constantly hear, think outside the square, or phrases like push the envelope or calling to touch base. We surveyed Australians and found the top 10 most irritating cliches. And what I found remarkable is that if you read them from end to end, it sounds like a pretty good political speech. And it is a red letter day, and because the election campaign has now finished on this election day, I thought just for old time's sake, because you're not going to hear these cliches for a while, I thought I'd share with you the top 10 most annoying cliches that you can avoid or look forward to in 3 years' time. We won't be ruling anything in or anything out, because at the end of the day, there's no magic bullet and the jury is still out on that anyway. But having said that, can I just say, moving forward, we're going to hit the ground running and give 110%. I think we want to avoid the cliches in our spoken word and in our visual presentation as well. I think until we can communicate our information in visual forms, it's not going to have the impact that it could have. People need to see it with the eyes of their head and with the eyes of their heart. And when they get it both cognitively and viscerally, when they get it rationally and emotionally, it has an impact. It changes lives. And that is best done when information is presented visually. You know, it's how information used to be presented back then. It's how data is now being presented today. And even next, it's how information will be presented into the future as well. Research is at its best when it's not tables, but visuals. When it's not just read, but seen. When it's research, you can see. Thank you.